Let's look at some more animals. Animal diversity part 2. In this lecture, please be able to define chordate, notochord, pharyngeal slits, gnathosomes, chondrichthyes, osteichthyes, lobe fins, tetrapod, and amphibian. For each major clade of vertebrates, remember these are mostly aquatic, be able to name one adaptation and list the adaptations required for land. So we're in the Cambrian again, and we're looking at a relatively small organism. It's about 3 centimeters long. It swims a bit, but it has something interesting. Instead of having segments with an exoskeleton, it's got segmented musculature. It's got a notochord for support. It has a dorsal hollow nerve cord, a post-anal tail, and pharyngeal slits, or these little slits along the side behind the head but before the fins, if there are fins. This little inauspicious creature would later give rise to the chordates. So here we can see these traits, the notochord being something on which the muscles are anchored, the dorsal hollow nerve cord instead of a ventral nerve cord like in the arthropods. There is an anus, and behind that anus there is a tail which can propel the organism through the water. And the pharyngeal slits, as I mentioned, are between the mouth and the anus, and they can actually allow the organism to pass water out of its body and to maybe even filter feed. This body plan gave rise to 2 organisms we can still see today, the lancelets and the tunicates. Those lancelets are basically the definition of a chordate, just those traits right there, and they kind of survive in the soil and do a little filter feeding. The early vertebrates probably looked very much like a lancelet. Tunicates diverged early, and they almost resemble sponges. The pharyngeal slits allow them to move water out. You can see a mouth and an anus kind of if you squint, and you realize that the larval form looks more like a chordate than the adult form. This is one of those cases where they evolved to look like something that already is in a niche. They just do it slightly differently than sponges. But those chordates would give rise to fish. That's right, those little lancelets living in the soil would give rise to fearsome predators like the one pictured here. As they developed bones, they developed the bones on the inside. As opposed to an exoskeleton, they have an endoskeleton, and eventually they would develop something called jaws. And remember how I said that the Cambrian was potentially a bias in fossilization due to hard shells and parts that can be fossilized easily? Well, bones can be broken with jaws, especially jaws as massive as these. So suddenly, these things are being preyed on, and these fish do really well. Not only that, but the inner ear of these organisms allows for better balance and better locomotion, allowing them to swim through this 3-dimensional environment very efficiently. That mineralized bone is not only armor, but became a muscle anchoring point. And we actually see for a while these bones become very prevalent, and the armored fish are leaving fossils everywhere. There is an extinction of armored fish later on, but we're not really going to cover that extinction in this class. Feel free to research it. It's kind of interesting. Vertebrates diversified greatly. You can see that common ancestor, and right off the bat we have the Myxini and the Petromyzodonta, the hagfish and lampreys. Those do not have jaws. The jaws, we have the chondrichthyes, which is cartilage-based fish. And that's the sharks, the rays, and chimeras. They have jaws, but they have cartilage instead of actually having bones. The actinopterygidae are going to have ray-like fins, and those are part of the osteichthyes. Osteichthyes have true bones, the bony fish. And those would give rise to a group called the lobe fins, which would be the coelacanths and the lungfishes. And those coelacanths and lungfishes would later give rise to a group called the tetrapods. And we're going to look at those at the end of today's lecture. These are all fish. I mean, if you're looking at most vertebrates, you're looking at fish. The humans are just some sort of weird fish that lives on land and is highly developed towards having a large brain and building things. Fish are the story of vertebrates. And we can see all of these different types of fish. There's a radiation of the different aquatic predators. Occupying that new niche and having jaws was highly adaptive. It was wonderful. And most fish live in the ocean now. You're like, hold on, wait, most fish? Yeah, well, you know, we have fish on land, and that's just your tetrapods. Unfortunately for tetrapods, they're going to be moving into occupied territory. So we're going to take a bit of a break and look at the arthropods. But first, how did they move onto land? Well, we have what are called exaptations and we have adaptations. You may remember talking about the flagella and calling it an exaptation because it was things that had already evolved from one purpose which are being co-opted in for another. The cuticle of a marine crustacean prevents it from drying out. But if it's in the water, it's not drying out. Why then do marine crustaceans have this exoskeleton with cuticle? Well, that's part of their support structure and it's part of their armor. So that already existed. When they went to land, it just kept them from drying out, which is a great adaptation. Plants, they did not have a way of protecting against drying out. They had to evolve that. And you can see in red all the things that had to evolve to allow a group to live on land. Green algae had to do a lot of evolving. This is why we spent so long on plants talking about plant adaptations to living on land. It was not easy for plants to evolve to live on land from green algae. Marine crustaceans were able to live on land pretty soon, and you can still see crabs kind of moving up onto land. They do have to go back to the water because their gas exchange system, their gills, are internal but still need to be moisturized. It would take a derived tracheal system for insects to be able to move on land, and we will look at that tracheal system later on. Aquatic lobe fins had to derive limbs in order to grow onto land because they had to walk around. Fish don't do well on land. You just see any fish on land. Protecting against drying out, that would come on later. And in fact, we're not going to cover that in this lecture. That will be one of the next lectures. But you can see which adaptations were required to live on land for both crustaceans and lobe fins. And it's no surprise that the arthropods got to land first. The cuticle prevents moisture loss in the arthropods. The segmentation is going to allow for specialization of segments, allowing them to crawl around on land, grow claws, maybe even grow a stinger like the scorpions. The jointed limbs are able to actually support the body, provided that the body isn't too heavy. So although the lobe fins had to evolve limbs to stand upright, the arthropods were pretty much all ready to do this. And part of this is, well, they're smaller. And their eggs can resist drying out because of their external shell on the eggs. So arthropods became the first land animals. The first arthropods ate the land plants and land fungi, but shortly behind those arthropods migrating to land, like millipedes, were things like centipedes, which would crawl onto land and eat the millipedes. And soon enough, we had competition between arthropods specializing on different plants, arthropods specializing on eating each other, and the high oxygen environment allowed for giant arthropods to survive on the land. Eventually, these arthropods evolved wings, and the evolution of wings allowed them to fly around on land, and, well, that was a great adaptation. How great? It gave rise to all insects, and insects are one of the most successful groups ever to live on land. They can fly around, and they have many different niches that they have filled. The tetrapods followed these insects on land, and this first one, this Tiktaalik, had all the characteristics of a chordate, had all the characteristics of a fish, but had some new tetrapod characteristics, like having a neck, like having ribs that were able to support it outside of water, having a fin-like skeleton, a flat skull, and oddly enough, the eyes on the top of the skull. That's probably because a lot of this time was spent in water, but it could move between different sources of water and spend a certain amount of time outside of water due to its lungs. Although the lungfish do have what are called lungs, it's kind of just an extension of the swim bladder where gas exchange occurs. The early tetrapods would take this to a new extreme, sometimes even losing the gills in order to move about on land. And these predators could hunt down the arthropods that were already on land. The tetrapods did not evolve herbivores first, predators later. Nope, they just evolved predators, moved onto land, and already had their snacks ready for them. The limbs later evolved digits, which are going to be later on to the fingers and hooves and all those kind of fun things. This allowed for greater mobility on land. And later on, they would lose the gills completely as they became the amphibians. Amphibios, dual lifestyle, aquatic larvae and terrestrial adults. That does mean they still have to be close to the water because that's where their larvae are going to live. They have moist skin, which tends to dehydrate kind of rapidly. They do have lungs, which allows them to breathe full time on land, but they can also breathe through their moist skin, which is a great adaptation because it's harder to drown a frog than you would think. They do dehydrate rapidly, meaning they will not be able to spend as much time in, say, the desert as the arthropods are. So there, at this time, would still be niches occupied by the arthropods that the early tetrapods could not enter. But we're going to see in a later lecture, the tetrapods gained control of all the land.